Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 9 and welcome to our reading of Mario Vargas Llosa's Death in the Andes. I told you at the beginning of the semester that every time I travel somewhere, I like to read as much of that region's literature as possible. So a couple of years ago, a professor in archaeology, Brandon Lewis at SMC, invited a bunch of people to go to Peru. He said, it's going to be a trip of a lifetime. You got to do it. And so I was like, sure, let's go. It's going to be a trip of a lifetime. And it was amazing. I'm going to share some pictures from it. But in preparation for going, I read, sort of Googled, Peruvian novels. And I read probably 3 or 4, and I believe all of them dealt with, in some way or another, the issue of the Sendero Luminoso, which is something that I had never heard of, right? So it's one of those interesting things that we sometimes get into a very American bubble, where our news doesn't really deal with news, what's happening in other countries that isn't related to us in some way. But so the Sendero Luminoso was a group of Maoist guerrillas who believed that they should and could turn Peru into a communist country through violent insurrection. And the way that they thought that they could do it was by infiltrating the sort of mountainous and indigenous communities and turning them against the government. So I found that out, and then while I was talking about the book with a friend, I found out A, she was from Peru, B, she left Peru because of the violence of the Sendero Luminoso. So again, it's one of those, this class is all about finding out what you don't know. I don't know a lot. So I want to show you, this is one of the pictures from my trip. And we traveled to a bunch of different places. One of those places was Arequipa, which is the hometown of Llosa, and I went to his library because that's what I did. And this is like a panoramic photograph that I took of his books that they have there. And it was one of those really humbling moments where I realized, looking at the shelf of books, most of which are written in Spanish, how much I will not know over the course of my lifetime, how much more there is to know and how much is inaccessible to me because I'm a monolingual person. I only speak English. So this is when I started studying Spanish, and I've taken many classes at SMC now, and I can mostly read in Spanish. Speaking is a little bit harder. It takes me a while, but I can do it. So as we get into this text, I put together a list of what I think is a helpful list of characters, vocabulary, and locations to guide you through the novel. And so that you can find this list here. It starts with characters in Nacos, which is where we are first located, and this is where the character Latuma and Tomas are located. But we also, because the novel moves back and forth in time really fluidly, we also have stories from characters from Carreño's, Tomas's past. This is a list of all the people who have disappeared, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And then I put together a list of important words because some of the language here is doesn't get translated, and so we'll hit these terms when they become relevant. And I think, and then important places, right? And so I'm gonna take you to Google Earth in a second to see where some of these places are. But the places in the novel, for the most part, are not places that we visited, right? They're not places that a typical tourist would go to. So one interesting fact is that the novel, when it was published in Peru in Spanish, was called Latuma en los Andes. And so you can see in the translation that we move from, this really specific reference to place, the Andes, and in the English translation, that's changed into death, right? So there is, we're always talking about what gets published and why, what gets translated and why, and often things that get translated are things that publishers believe will reach a larger audience. So I think it's telling that in that translation, they dropped the main character's name, and the focus on the Andes as a place of mystery and danger gets shifted onto just death, right? So it's just interesting to think about what sells. Um, okay, so as we get into this, I want to look at a couple of things. So your next assignment, I'm going to ask you to play around in Google Earth, which is like an illuminated globe that you can look at online. And since we can't travel right now, it's sort of an amazing tool. But what I did is I made a project based on where we traveled when we were in Peru for our trip. So we started off in Lima. And Lima is the current capital of Peru, but pre-conquest, so it's pre the Spanish invasion, the capital of what would have been the Inca Empire was not on the coast. It was Cusco. So if we move from Lima to Cusco, and sometimes these animations can be a little bit, make you a little bit nauseous. Woo! It's super inland. It's way up in the mountains. It's at about 8,000 feet elevation. And it's so remote that when I'll zoom out so you can see this, when the Spanish arrived, they never invaded as far in as Cusco and Machu Picchu, which is where most people, when you go to Peru, you go to Machu Picchu, which is this old Incan ruins, and they're there because the Spaniards never infiltrated that far, because this region is insanely difficult to exist in, right? You're talking about elevations that are so high that at a certain point, the only thing that can exist are lichens and really simple vegetation. And we traveled to some of those places. It's freezing, and you get what's called cerucho, which is like altitude sickness. So most people there drink coca tea or chew coca leaves, which is what you make cocaine out of. But you would need like a bazillion coca leaves to make a little bit of cocaine. So you're not high all the time, but it helps to deal with the altitude sickness, and it totally did, right? So for a lot of people on the trip who weren't drinking the coca tea, they really struggled with things like just headaches and pain. But those of us who drank the coca tea were fine. So the other thing is that these regions, right? So if you look, you have this coast, right, which is at sea level, and then the spine of the country is the Andes, right? The spine of all of what we think of as South America now, right, is the Andes, and it goes through Ecuador and Colombia as well, down into Chile and through Bolivia. And so Peru as a country has these coasts, this really difficult to traverse terrain through the Andes, and then the Amazon rainforest. So it's a very varied region. Our trip, we were mostly here in the south. So that is where I think I want to show you a lot more, but I don't want to take too much time. Okay, so as we get into the novel, I want to, as I think I've talked about before, but focus on things like epigraphs, right? So this book, it's a Peruvian novel, but Llosa himself is he's a very well-versed academic scholar, right? He ran at one point for president of Peru. He is a statesman there. He's very very well regarded. But he begins with an epigraph from William Blake, right, whose poetry we just read. He is considered one of the greatest romantic poets of the English tradition, although he's considered part of the five big names, right? You have Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron, and then Blake is kind of this weird outsider. But anyway, it begins with an epigraph from The Ghost of Abel, which is this really bizarre poem play that he wrote about basically according to the Christian tradition, man's fall from grace. And it reads, Cain's city, built with human blood, not blood of bulls and goats. So in the story of the Bible of Cain, he was jealous of his brother Abel and killed him. And so here he's kind of describing that fratricide and what happens when people start destroying each other in that way. But as we move along in this reading, what seems to be a kind of symbolic or metaphorical reference to the story of Cain starts to feel a little bit more real, right? What do we mean if we're sacrificing human blood? Is that what's happening? Okay, so the story begins, and I just want to take us through the first couple of pages because it's a book that works by dislocating us, right, and making it difficult to know not just what's real or not, but also what is the story that we're being told. And part of this has to do with the fact that what he's writing about is the rise of the Sendero Luminoso, which was, as I said before, a Marxist guerrilla organization led by this charismatic leader, Abimael Guzman, which believed that Peru could undergo basically a Maoist revolution like what happened in China, right? And they thought that the way to do that was through a prolonged military offensive, mobilizing the peasantry, and then finally surrounding and assaulting the cities, right? This is their big plan. And what ended up happening is the Sendero Luminoso, those people committed tons and tons of violence, much of it well documented. But then when the government came in to try to stop them, they were equally violent in many ways and indiscriminately violent in some ways. And it was not always clear who was on what side. So one thing that I give you and suggest that you do is to read Llosa's Inquest in the Andes. So he was responsible for, he was one of the people who was on this inquest that looked into one particularly violent occurrence in this, it wasn't a war or whatever it was, in this horrible kind of terrorist violence. And so I give you a link to that. It was a New York Times article. It's long, but it takes you through all the characters and what happens. But what's interesting is that even then, even after all of that, it's not clear what happened. So this uncertainty has a lot to do. This is Brandon Lewis. He's our SMC archaeology professor who took us on this trip. Cusco, Machu Picchu, Lake Titicaca. But this is what I want to show you. So when I went to when we were in Lima, I went to this exhibition, which was the result of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the country had in an attempt to try to recover and basically acknowledge the violence and move on from it. And so they kind of took all of the testimony from people who experienced that and tons of photographs. And it's an entire floor of an office building dedicated to photographs. This is Abimael Guzman, who was the leader. This is a picture of some of the senderistas. They would have red flags. This is a picture of people whose family members were disappeared. And so what happened is that in many cases it was, the terrorists or the Sendero Luminoso would go into these villages and try to convert everybody, and people who didn't would be killed, or they would have these show trials where they would try all of the people in the town who were associated with the government or with capitalism and kill them. What would also happen is that the military would go in, unsure of whether the peasants or the campesinos in these regions were part of the Sendero Luminoso or not, and so they would also get killed. Because the people who live in these regions are largely Quechua speaking. They speak the language of the Inca language, the pre-conquest language, and they don't speak Spanish. So you can't, there's really an inability to communicate. And that's where the novel begins. Right, so the novel begins when he saw the Indian woman appear at the door of the shack. Latuma guessed what she was going to say. and so Indian in